Tell us about the Federal Department of Labor. What are the main responsibilities that the minister has in administering that department?
It's the only portfolio in the government that has its own holiday. I will say that, Labor Day. So I'm proud of that. And we administer the Labor Code, the Canada Labor Code. It's about 10% of the total workers in Canada, which isn't a lot. But it's in the industries that matter a lot to Canadians. It's in transportation, air, road, rail. It's in the banking system. It's in the communications system. These are the things that bind you as a country. They're the national infrastructure, especially the economic infrastructure. So it matters what we do. But I have 3 parts of the Act, and again, I go back to the Act. The first part deals with industrial relations. I have a great team of about 20 mediators out there in the country who help parties who can't get to deals.
Could you give us some examples in terms of appointing mediators and what kind of disputes that they would have to resolve?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Because there's 2 aspects to it. Under the Act, it's prescribed that if 2 parties can't get to a deal, they can give a notice of conciliation to the minister. That gives me 15 days to appoint somebody to go in, because they're saying, hey, you know what, we've done face-to-face bargaining, we're not going anywhere. Or alternatively, they haven't been able to meet because one party won't meet. So we send a conciliation officer, and for 60 days they have to meet with conciliation officers. And
they're required by law.
They're required by law. There's a 60-day period.
So if it's the Royal Bank and their employees, they're required by law to sit with the conciliator.
Yeah. Now, they may not sit all 60 days, and they may play games with their schedules and stuff like that, but they have to make the effort to negotiate at the table. And that individual, again, it's about patience and judgment and reading people. They try to help the parties communicate and get to a position and maybe offer up suggestions of how to break impasses. And that's what their job is. When the 60 days is up, the officer writes a report to the minister, and if still there is no deal, there's a 21-day cooling off period.
Now, Minister, when you say that they write a report to the minister,
correct,
is this a document that both labor and management would get a copy of?
Absolutely. Yep, they get a copy of it. And it depends on when they give the copy to the minister, but they do get to see it. They get to see what the results are. In extreme situations, instead of an individual who's employed by Labor Canada, I can appoint an outside person, a conciliator commissioner. And we've done that in the past, and that kind of shows you that we're looking at this in a different way, that we think it needs to be a little higher level of, I'm not saying that my guys aren't good, they're fantastic, but you need a little bit of an outside help on this one, because it's a little bit more complex or a little bit more difficult for a government person to help on it. And the commissioner would write a report, and the parties get the copy. And the parties never like seeing the report of the commissioner. And the reason being is it could form part of what their collective agreement could look like, because the powers that lie with the Parliament, and one of them is that we can actually legislate a contract.
So you get a report.
Yeah.
What happens next?
They're in their 21-day cooling off period. They are not allowed to take work action, either a strike or a lockout, for 21 days, and I appoint a mediator, because it's not over. They just need a little bit more time. And the mediator, oftentimes is the same person, will go back and say, well, this is what we found. This is where you ended up at the end of conciliation. Let's continue to talk. Let's continue to talk. And you make your way through the 21-day period. And then at the end of the 21 days, either party has the ability to give me 72 hours notice of a strike or a lockout.
And then what powers do you have in that 72 hours?
Not a lot. None. Minister has no powers, which is interesting because everybody thinks that you have some. If it's a matter of national significance, where we think a work stoppage is going to be detrimental to the economy, I actually engage sometimes, I would say, around day 18 of the 21 days, and I'll call the parties together and I'll ask them, do they have hope of getting there? Do you have your plan set up if there's a work stoppage? What is it going to look like for the Canadian people? And we have that kind of conversation, and sometimes we can get deals, and in the case of the BC ports, we were able to get deals. But in some cases, you're just continuing on through to the 72 hours. The only other thing that I can do after the 72 hours notice is given, or at any time actually, is after that conversation about what are your plans to continue and what do you think the effects are going to be on the Canadian public, if I have a health and safety question, I can refer the matter for further study to the Canadian Industrial Relations Board. And I've done that about 9 out of 25 times in the past 3 years. And the reason being is there was a concern that there'd be an effect on the health and safety of Canadians. Parties at the beginning of the process are supposed to sit down and determine, okay, are there any services that we have to do for health and safety for Canadians? A lot of the times they determine, no, of course not, we're not that important. And it's for me to do the double check at the back end. But I don't always do it, and it really has to be a compelling case.
Now, but you also have the power to take a bill to Parliament.
Correct.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, we've done that a number of times. And I do mean unfortunately. It is an exercise that has a lot of time that goes into it. But it only happens in extreme cases. And I'll give you an example. You know, rail and air traffic and the post office have been the 3 areas in which, for the last 50 years, governments have passed special acts of Parliament in order to order them back to work and provide them a way to reach their own deal. And it's done time and time again. And I've done 4 since 2010, which is a significant amount, I recognize, but it makes a lot of sense when you think of it this way. Anything can be negotiated. Anybody can get to any deal if there aren't extenuating circumstances that make it almost impossible to get a deal. And I would submit the past 3 years, it's been almost impossible for parties to deal with issues around defined benefit pensions and what's been happening in the long-term bond market and what's been happening in terms of returns for their pensions. Most of the pensions in this country are underfunded, and companies are grappling with it, and pensioners are grappling with it, and people are very worried about whether they're going to have their pension. So difficult for the bargaining committee of a union to agree to concessions on a pension at the table. Extremely difficult. And in the cases of Air Canada, where we ended up doing back-to-work legislation, they had deals that were agreed to by the bargaining team and failed ratification. And I think that's an important piece to remember. So these were cases where they tried and they weren't going to get ratification. In the case of Canada Post, they couldn't get to a deal because the concessions were too big, in their view, at that point in time. And in the case of the Teamsters, again, it was about the pension. So, you know, in the 80s, it was about job security and wage increases. And for us, certainly, it's about how to deal with pensions and health care benefits and the long-term care of people once they retire.
Are you worried, Minister, that the parties are saying, well, you know, we really don't have to make an agreement here. We'll give this file to the Minister. She's done it on 4 specific occasions.
Yeah.
Let her do our work for us. Is there part of that happening?
Well, what's interesting about that is I don't tell the parties what they're going to get, and they may end up getting something they don't want. For example, in the case of Canada Post, because it's a Crown corporation, we legislated the wages. I don't think anybody expected that. In the case of Air Canada, we sent it to final offer selection because of the connection with the government, again, in terms of it being a legacy corporation. And with respect to Canadian Pacific, we didn't put any constraints on it. It's just arbitration, something that the parties should have and could have agreed to at the table themselves. So they didn't win anything. Nobody won anything by going to me, except they had to appear before Senate and they had to appear before us, and they ended up with, I guess, an 11-day strike too at the same time. And so, you know, I would say to people who have that notion, you never know what you're going to get. And we monitor and we know what's happening in these negotiations. And if there's a party who is deliberately not bargaining in good faith, we will tailor our legislation to reflect.
To take that into account.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a possibility. And that's the unknown. And quite frankly, Unions are sophisticated organizations,
They certainly are.
and so are companies. And I would submit that any CEO or any president worth their salt never wants to give their destiny to a third party, which is made up of 308 members of parliament in the House of Commons. That's not the way to do business.
Tell us about the pension issue. I mean, I see the pension issue emerging as a very, very challenging issue, not only for governments, but for the private sector and for unions in terms of going forward. From your perspective, how is that being handled within the jurisdiction that you have as the Minister of Labour? Are you happy with the way in which it's being addressed?
In the private federal jurisdiction is first out of the gate in dealing with it. The public sector is not. We're not there. We may have made some changes with respect to funding, but certainly it hasn't been tackled to the extent that the federal private sector has. I got to tell you, I'm very pleased with what happened. In 2011, the first group of Air Canada employees to go out and give a strike notice were CAW workers, and they're the customer service agents. And although I did table back to work legislation, I never had to, and I introduced it, I never had to proceed because Ken Lowenza of the CAW and Air Canada's negotiators were able to negotiate for themselves an agreement on how they would deal with third-party arbitration. And they went to final offer selection, and they put the pension as one of the pieces that had to be negotiated, knowing that Air Canada is very underfunded with respect to their pension. And CAW came up with this proposal of a hybrid pension, Part DB, Part DC, meaning defined contribution. And it was brilliant. And they won the final offer selection as a result. So people say that that always is beneficial to the companies, not in this case. And what Air Canada did from that point on was just lift up that kind of proposal and apply it to the rest of the unions. And I think we're seeing that actually go into other parts of the federal private jurisdiction. So it was a great example of people within their own arbitration setting being able to find their way to a solution that works, that kind of gives you a little bit of defined benefit so that people know they're going to get something and that they're not completely to the whims of a market, and they get a bit of defined contribution, which gives the company some room, not worrying about exactly how big a liability they're going to have in the future.
Do you think that this is going to be the model going forward?
I think it's going to be a model. Every company is going to have to deal with their unions in different ways. Some companies have gone directly to defined contribution. Others have a little bit more different nuances as to what can happen. But I'm getting a more comfortable feeling about the federal private jurisdiction in terms of how they're dealing with their pensions. They still have some big issues, Bell and Canada Post and you know, the BCMEA and the ILW. They all have pensions that they worry about, and the reason being is, as probably a lot of people know, is when the pension's underfunded, the entity, meaning the employer, who promises the pension has to actually put actual cash into the fund to bring it up to a certain level. It comes right off the balance sheet. So in the case of CP last year, they wanted to do infrastructure improvements. They wanted to do a capital plan, but they had to put a significant amount of money into their pension plan, which kind of diverted it from what they thought they needed to be doing for business. So they ended up with a SOF, and they agreed to their pension plan too.
Just one aspect of a public policy issue on the pensions. Do you see any movement within the country, whether in your jurisdiction or elsewhere, as it relates to the Canada Pension Plan, in terms of changes there, in terms of trying to perfect better pensions for people in the future? Do you see that happening?
There's a dialogue going on. Ken Giorgetti of the Canadian Labour Congress, certainly them and the steelworkers talked about it at their most recent policy convention as well too in Vancouver, that CPP and fixing it, in their view, is an important thing. Businesses don't necessarily feel that way, and it's a balancing. So luckily, that's not my file. That's Minister of Finance's file. He had a conversation with his counterparts a couple of years ago, the provinces, the first ministers, and the finance ministers rather, and they couldn't come to an agreement on how to deal with CPP. So it's something that Labour wants. But we introduced our own version of pension plan help, pooled pension plans, in order to get people to invest that way. And we have the TIFSA and stuff like that to try to help people, encourage them to save and look after for their own retirement too.
Are you seeing a lot of sexual harassment and mental health issues in the jurisdiction that you have to administer coming to the forefront?
That's an excellent question. The mental health issues really has been one of my, from day one, has been of great interest to me. And it comes from an honest place. And that's the fact, I was CEO of a port authority for about 8 years. And you do see people who are struggling and you don't know how to help them. And it ends up with either them taking short-term or long-term disability, or in some cases they take their own lives. And so it's a really serious issue. And I wanted to approach it from the point of view of mental health in the workplace. And I have encountered nothing but cooperation and help from both businesses, be it Bell or TELUS, and from unions, CAW, CLC. They have been absolutely amazing. And I'm hoping that in a couple of weeks I'm going to have, I started my portfolio by having a roundtable with members of unions on mental health in the workplace. And I'm hoping in a couple of weeks to bring them all back in and having a chat and seeing how we've done in the past 3 years and where things are going. So it's a big issue, and it's just going to get bigger.
I see where a lot of employee assistance programs now are having to deal with more and more mental health issues, and I suspect that is a growing concern.
It is. I think employers are concerned about it because they're losing good people. If you look at mental health issues, Dave, the problem is that they strike you in your best earning years and your most productive years, between 28 years old and 50 years old. This is where people get struck down with these issues, which takes out an incredible proportion of talent from an employer's workforce. So they're worried about it from that point of view. They're worried about it from the point of view of productivity, because you may have absenteeism, but presenteeism, which is you just go in and go through the motions, is difficult on productivity. But finally, to your point on the reason why we really have to do better, is we have a lot of people who have no other options on how to deal with it, so they disengage from the workforce and they either take short-term disability or long-term disability. It's a cost to the company, no question, but it's a cost to human life, because the minute you're taken out of a place where you have information and attachment and something to go to work for, essentially, your ability to recover plummets, and you've got to keep people within the workforce. How do you do that? You have programming, you have understanding, you deal with it in the workplace. But to give you the stat, and I know you know it, when I came in 2010, I asked for the stats of what it looked like, both private sector and public sector. And we were hovering around 40% of total short-term disability claims were mental health, anxiety related. 3 years later, it's 60%. 60%. And a lot of it has to do with the fact we recognize the stigma and we ask people to talk out. And that's great, but now you got to back it up with something. And what has to happen is we need the workplace and we need the companies to take advantage of the stuff that we have out there. Mental Health Commission has done great work on developing, paying for a standard developed by the Canadian Standards Association and the Bureau of Normalisation de Quebec, as well, on what to do in the workplace for mental health. And Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety have a free tool, a free guide on what to look for in the workplace. So putting that in the hands of employers is going to be work.
You've taken a real leadership role on the mental health issue.
Yeah.
As you look internationally, what can you share with us in terms of the internationally as it relates to mental health or sexual harassment? Is it coming down? Are other jurisdictions acknowledging the significance of it? How are we doing, Canada, in comparison to other countries?
Well, we are so far advanced compared to other countries. Australia is trying to get to where we are right now. We're the first in the world to develop a standard for the workplace. And it's voluntary, and that's the key. We're not putting more regulation on companies, but we're providing them the tools to help themselves. But Australia is very interested in what we do, and Louise Bradley, who's the president of the Mental Health Commission, has been to Australia to talk to them, and they've been in contact with me. We've as a government, have taken a big picture approach to mental health. Leona Glucock does all the work as the Minister of Health. I have a teeny tiny part in the workplace, but I stand with her in trying to make sure that we hit all sectors, and we do what we can. But it's just staggering. And we've got to deal with the problem because we are a shrinking population, and we really do need to make sure we can maintain as many people in the workplace as we can. It's a numbers game.
Now, you have a special position as Minister of Labor. You get to see and actually engage with different negotiators, whether they be from management, whether they be from labor, whether they be from government. From your perspective, where you sit as the minister at the top of the pinnacle, what are some of the great qualities that you see in good negotiators, or some of the qualities in bad negotiators? Without mentioning names.
Okay, that's fair. I think, yeah, because there's good and bad on all sides, including the government. I would say that what I value most is somebody who's going to be candid and frank with me. Tell me what you can do. Tell me what you can't do. And if I'm involved, we are at 0 hour. Like, something's going to happen. If the Minister of Labor gets involved, you know that there's going to be a cry for some kind of parliamentary interaction.
Some sanction is coming.
Something is going to happen if the minister is involved. Doesn't mean that we're going to order you back to work. Doesn't matter. But obviously, it's important to the government that the minister is involved in a real way. So what I appreciate at the table is candid, and I learned a lot. My first time bringing the parties together was a disaster. Thank God they were able to get themselves to a deal. But I learned from the people at the table, and I want to know if you can do a deal, and I want to know whether or not you can get it ratified. Those are the two things. Is it impossible for you to get ratification of a deal? Because if that's the case, we need to figure out what to do, and we need to help you get to a place where you can get a deal that can get ratified. And I don't know what that looks like all the time. So the ones that are honest with me with that, I really appreciate it. And I'm going to give a shout out. Ken Loenza is by far the easiest negotiator on either side of the table to deal with, because he's frank and he's known for telling it like it is, and boy does he ever. If he says to me, Minister, if we don't get a deal here, we're going on strike in 72 hours, he's going to go on strike in 72 hours. No game. It's not about
so that quality of being honest.
Yeah,
it's still pretty important.
I know, honest is such a tough word, because it's not that the other people are dishonest, but Ken wants to get a deal, and he understands. He's done probably thousands of negotiations, and he knows up to a certain point, it's almost like you're doing the same dance between the parties. And then you get to a point, and you can have a choice of which way it's going to go. When I ask who's on the file and they say CAW, I'm actually relieved, because I know that they're going to be able to, they're going to be tough. They're going to be really
tough.
tough.
They're sophisticated. They know the process. They understand the issues.
Big picture, yeah. Yep. And
on the
tough.
management side?
And on the management side, don't give me numbers that are ridiculous, and don't tell me that the sky's falling when it's not, because that is not helpful to getting a deal done. And remember, I'm not the government. I'm the Minister of Labor. My job is to help the parties get to a deal. If you want to go and talk to the government, if you want to talk to somebody else about how your business is doing, that's fine. That's your purview. But you need to be honest with me about what the real situation is. And more importantly, if you're going to say it to me, you have to say it to the union as well. They have to know how dire it is. I can't be the conduit. And don't have a situation happen where 3 months later it turns out your numbers were incorrect, because that's going to bite you too.
Now, Minister, what would you say to young people who are watching our show here in terms of their own negotiations, whether it's their first time of a job, whether it's buying a house? What would you advise them in terms of their own careers and their own goals and objectives?
Don't rush it. My very first negotiation with CUPE 416 at the port, I wanted to get rid of all of the dancing part. I wanted to go directly to the end. I wanted to know how much money they wanted. I just wanted to get it over with. That's not how it works. You do need a long time period for people to get to know each other, take your time, understand what the issues are, and the time does matter. A lot of people think it's a waste of time. It's not. You do it once every 4 years. You might as well put the time into doing it right. The other side, the other piece of advice, and it's more for people who are interested in industrial relations as a career, which I think is an incredible career. Work on your relationship every day. Don't let it happen that you're in your open contract period, therefore you need to talk to the union. There should be discussions with the union and partnership with the union all the way through, and if you need help, we are there to help you in the federal government through preventative mediation and get them to a good place of communications.
Do you see that happening in your jurisdiction, that there is more engagement going on now than ever before?
We're trying. We're trying. In 2011, Minister of Finance gave me $1 million to set up a national strategy for preventative mediation, and we're rolling it out across the country now. So we've had a workshop in Burlington, really well attended. We're having one in Halifax soon. I expect we'll get really good attendance. And it's people just interested, curious, because everybody wants to get a deal. They want to get a deal that's fair, and they want to make sure the information they get at the table is accurate. And the best way to do those things is by talking along the way. And I would say to CEOs, if anyone's a future CEO, put money into human resources and into that kind of relationship building. It's just as important as it is to investing in machinery or investing in technology. Invest in your people, and it saves you a lot of pain at the end of the day. Happy workforce is a productive workforce.
Are you seeing that in the private sector? Are you seeing that more and more senior executives are acknowledging the challenges on the human resource side than ever before? Before it was trying to identify sources of capital, which is still an issue for a lot of different businesses. But is the pendulum swinging towards the HR side?
Some cases, yes. I think a lot of CEOs still try to hire the best person they can in that role and don't really have a hands-on. But I will say that Bell Alliant in Halifax is a great example of walking the walk. They had a really terrible strike a number of years ago. It was violent, and their relationship with the union was decimated. And they said, well, we've got nothing to lose, let's try preventative mediation. And we got our people in, and it's working. They got a deal before the contract expired last time, which saves you lots of time and money. And they're continuously working on it day to day, and you need that. You got to have your team hold together, and especially in the federal jurisdiction where 90% of a company can be unionized, you better get it together and work. And I can give you an example of bad human resources relationships right now, and that's Air Canada. It's not that's the downside of going through back to work legislation is. And this is why I would say to management, you don't want to have this. It's short-term gain, maybe in their minds, but it's a long-term pain because you don't have a relationship with your unions anymore because you had to have mom or dad in Parliament sort out your fight. So you don't have a relationship, and that's very expensive.
So we started off by talking about relationships.
Yeah.
We're ending about relationships here. Can you explain a little bit about your project in terms of the preventive mediation, in terms of how it actually works and the benefits that are there? You mentioned Bell Alliant in Halifax, but how does that actually work?
So we will send mediators in to bring the parties together and just start with general topics of discussion. Just get them acclimatized to being with one another in a room where you're not negotiating something specific like a collective agreement. And sometimes there's difficulties with even talking about a topic like hockey, for example. I mean, but it's really just to start, it's almost like marriage therapy in a way. It's just about getting the parties to talk to one another and see each other as individuals and human beings as opposed to the enemy. And it sounds very basic, but that is the key to making sure that when you get to the point of having a really tough topic drop on your table during a collective bargaining session, you say, well, you know, Joe wouldn't do that to me. He's not trying to mess with us. He obviously has something that's important to him, and there's something, so I need to listen to him, and maybe I can help him in some way. So what preventative mediation does is it just acclimatizes people, and it gets them to a point, and sometimes you can deal with grievances in a much easier way, which again, you know, a grievance and going all the way to arbitration and a grievance within the collective agreement can be extremely expensive and time consuming as well, both for the union and for the company, and you want to avoid those as well too. So you have a forum. They meet frequently, like every 2 weeks, once a month, and sometimes they have lots to talk about, sometimes they don't, but it's extremely important. And if I could just, not on preventive mediation, but to show you where that really worked, we got 8-year deals in the ports on the West Coast. And I believe that they were sitting in a position to give me 72 hours notice of a strike or lockout for about 13 months, and they never did. And I believe the reason why they never did and why they kept talking at the table is because ILWU and Tom Dufresne knew how important the gateway was to their community, to their province, and to their country. And they understood the importance of trade, and they understood that what BCMEA was trying to do. BCMEA never locked out because, of course, you lock out on that side of the coast, you're going to end up hearing from a lot of people and a lot of shippers. So that, to me, is proof in the pudding that they themselves knew how important it was. They would continue to talk. They weren't getting anywhere. But they knew how important it was to each other, and they never went to that, you know, that nuclear button. No one ever pushed it, and I'm grateful for that because we ended up with a competitive deal that makes us, you can't touch us in the world with respect to labor peace on the West Coast. So the Asia-Pacific Gateway was the benefit for that one.
Congratulations.
Well, you know, if you want to hear the horror stories, to get the foreman to agree, I locked them in. I did the typical thing. I locked them in a room. I slept in the office outside the room. No one was allowed to leave. If they left, they would suffer the consequences in the legislation. And 24 hours later, they walked out with a deal. So sometimes old school stuff, the stuff we learned, you know, from the coal miners at home. And
tell me, what are some of your big challenges going forward now? You're Minister of Labor. You've had a great career up to now, and I'm sure you're going to have a continued successful career.
So I mentioned that I have kids. My kids are 11 and 8. I always think through the lens of family. One of the statistics in labor that really troubles me is how many young kids on their first job die, get injured, maimed. It's the highest proportion of accidents in the workplace is young kids. First job, you know, 17, 18 years old. And we need to do better in health and safety on that. So we've got an approach right now where we're advertising for kids, well, actually we work out here too, submit films on your first job and why health and safety is important. And we've got some really good people judging the short product. And whoever wins gets to compete in a worldwide competition on film. And we're hoping that we get people involved from the video side of the world, that they're interested in showing their expertise.
I never realized that the stats are quite high.
It is. Actually, it's an area that the Prime Minister asked me to focus on in 2010 when I took over, and I continue to try to move the needle for us. Not so much in the federal world, but definitely in the provinces. Every single minister of labor in this country is concerned with this. We talk about it all the time. And we're trying, either by having a social media strategy or whatever, but it comes down to the parents and the first employers. Before you leave school, before you leave your house for your first job, I just want parents to have the conversation. It's very simple. If you think something you're doing is not safe, you can refuse to do it. It's that simple. Just don't do it.
That's a pretty good message.
Don't take the risk.
That's a pretty
And
good
employers,
message.
If you make them do it, you will be held fully accountable under the criminal code and under occupational health and safety. There's a kid, 17 years old. This one kills me, Dave, because I feel it in my bones. 17 years old, has a job at the Walmart up in New Brunswick, and he's polishing the floor, and there's a short in the polisher, and he's killed, electrocuted. Only child for this couple. Walmart got fined $200,000. This is the part that bugs me. The manager of the Walmart bought this polisher at a garage sale. wasn't certified, wasn't checked. So you know what? We don't have time for that nonsense.
Boy.
So it's those stories like that. So that's the challenge, is to keep our youth safe and get them well educated in health and safety, either through the school system or through mom and dad having the conversation.
Well, on behalf of the Ryerson Negotiation Project, the students and the faculty, I want to express to you our sincere appreciation for taking time out of your schedule and to be here and share your insights and your views and your observations on the whole negotiation process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.